Our study is on the subject of the challenge and the sackcloth. It really is going to take us into Isaiah chapter 36 because it's going to be an examination of the challenge of Rabshakeh and how Hezekiah responded to that challenge. But before we come to that, I wonder if you would turn with me to the 2nd of Chronicles chapter 32, because there in the 2nd of Chronicles 32, we have a useful introduction to what we'll consider later on in the prophecy of Isaiah. And I just want to draw your attention to one matter in this passage. You might remember we referred to this in our introductory comments last night. 2 Chronicles 32 verse 1 says, "After these things and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered into Judah and encamped against the fenced cities and thought to win them for himself. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was come and that he was purposed to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with his princes." And the verses that follow tell us what the things were that Hezekiah did to prepare for the evident invasion now that was clearly so imminent from Sennacherib and from the Assyrians. And he did three things. He first of all guaranteed the water supply into Jerusalem by blocking up the spring Gihon. He fortified the city as best as he could, and he re-equipped and reorganized the army so that they would be ready to fight whatever battle of resistance they could. But the most important thing that Hezekiah did is recorded for us in the 2nd of Chronicles chapter 32 and reading from verse 6, where it says, "He set captains of war over the people and gathered them together to him in the street of the gate of the city and spake comfortably to them." The margin says, spake to their heart. "And these were the words that he spake. Be strong and courageous. Be not afraid nor dismayed for the king of Assyria, nor for all the multitude that is with him, for there be more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is Yahweh our God to help us and to fight our battles." And the people rested themselves upon the words of Hezekiah. So here's the thing, you see, is that beyond all his practical preparations, Hezekiah's real focus was on encouraging the people to put their trust unreservedly in God and in his mighty power to save. But the wonderful thing about these two verses is that everything that Hezekiah spoke in order to speak to the heart of his people rang with the power of Scripture. He was a master not just of encouraging his people, but of doing so by the triumphant words of Scripture themselves. Now, just have a look at this because it's helpful in terms of maybe some cross-references in your margin. So when he said, "Be strong and courageous," those words were the words spoken by Moses to Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 31 when they were facing the nations of Canaan. And when he said, "Be not afraid nor dismayed," those were the words that Jahaziel spoke to Jehoshaphat in the 2nd of Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 15 when facing the multitudes of Ammon. When he said, "There be more with us than with him," you might remember that those were the words actually spoken by Elisha to his servant in the 2nd of Kings 6 and verse 16 when facing the host of the Syrians. And when he said, "With us is Yahweh our God to help us and to fight our battles," those were the words spoken by Moses to Israel in Deuteronomy 20 verses 3 to 4 when facing the enemy. So you see, this is how the king spake to the heart of the nation, brothers and sisters. He took them back to the Bible, took them back to Scripture, took them back to the passages and events of old, to marvelous examples of victories in earlier times. And what he was really saying, don't you think, King Hezekiah, was he saying, look, our God has done this before. Our God can do this again. But he didn't use his words. He used the words of Scripture to inspire them. And the record says, isn't it lovely, at the end of verse 8, "And the people rested themselves upon the words of Hezekiah." Margin says they leaned. Have you ever leaned upon a word, brothers and sisters? Rested upon a word at the right time. So helpful. And maybe there's a lesson here, you see, that in times of national crisis, people desperately need strong spiritual guidance. And where there is sound leadership, people feel the reassurance of knowing what to do. But when it's not there, where clear direction is lacking, people feel confused. They're left feeling divided. And Hezekiah had that skill, that special skill of inspiring the nation to have confidence in God, because they saw that same unwavering trust in his own life, in everything that he spoke to them when he spoke to their heart. So with that background then, let's come to the book of Isaiah now, to those dramatic chapters that we're going to consider, God willing, in our studies together, beginning with Isaiah 36. And it's in Isaiah 36 that we take up the record, as we're told there in verse 1 these words. Now, it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defenced cities of Judah and took them. In fact, interestingly enough, in his own record of the attack, which is on the Taylor Prism, it's one of those clay prisms on which the exploits of Sennacherib are recorded. And on that Taylor Prism, Sennacherib says this: "But as for Hezekiah the Jew, 46 of his strong-walled towns and innumerable smaller villages in their neighborhood I besieged and conquered." In fact, the Assyrians took 200,000 people of Judah into captivity. 200,000. This was a crisis, an absolute crisis in the life of Hezekiah and also for the nation of Judah. And so the record tells us in verse 2, the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh from Assyria, from Lachish, which is where Sennacherib was, to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army, and he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. And then came forth unto him, says verse 3, Eliakim, Hilkiah's son, which was over the house, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah, Asaph's son, the recorder. Now, it's always interesting, incidentally, when you've got parallel versions of a king, or of any man's life or woman's life, it's always helpful to consult the other versions. Now, we shan't turn it up, but in the 2nd of Kings, chapter 18, verse 18, which is the parallel account in Kings, it says this: "And when they," which is Rabshakeh and his cohorts, "had called to the king, there came out to them Eliakim and Shebna and Joah." So you see, what Kings tells us, which Isaiah doesn't, is that Rabshakeh sought an audience with Hezekiah in person, but Hezekiah refused. He would not go out to meet Rabshakeh. He would not allow Rabshakeh into the city. And so instead, he sent deputies to depute on his behalf. Rabshakeh never did meet the king. He departed from Jerusalem without ever seeing him. And now his speech is about to begin. And we can imagine he was probably extremely annoyed that Hezekiah had refused to meet him. Now, Isaiah 36 is one of those chapters, like many a chapter, brothers and sisters, where in its fullness and its length and extent, it just looks overwhelmingly big to try and break up and dissect. So it's always helpful to have a breakup, isn't it? And I think that the breakup to Rabshakeh's speech helps us immensely to suddenly master Isaiah 36 by breaking it into its subcomponent parts. So here's the speech of Rabshakeh. And when you see it, brothers and sisters, it all becomes, I think, really thoroughly clear. So we've got really what we might describe in the first instance as the speech to the king from verses 4 to 10. And we know that because in verse 4 we see these words, "Say ye now to Hezekiah." So even though Hezekiah is not there, he's inside the city and his 3 deputies are outside listening to Rabshakeh. These words were intended for the king himself. It's Rabshakeh's speech to the king. And we know that because, do you notice the word thou in this section? Verse 4, "What confidence is this wherein thou trustest?" Verse 5, "Dost thou trust that thou rebellest against me?" Verse 6, "Thou trustest in the staff." Verse 7, "If thou say to me," and all the way through those verses 4 to 10, the word thou in the Hebrew is in the masculine singular. It's an address to one man. This is Rabshakeh's speech to the king himself. And then in the middle, we're going to have an exchange with the deputies where the 3 men in turn will seek to say something to Rabshakeh and he will reply to them. And then we've got the second speech, which is now from verses 13 to 20, and we might describe as the speech to the people. It's a separate speech. It's a second speech. And when it says, therefore, hear ye the word, verse 13, of the great king, the king of Assyria, now the word ye refers to the people on the wall that were the subjects of this second address that Rabshakeh would utter to them. And we know that that's the case because now, if you notice, you'll find that not the word thou is used, but the word you. Verse 14, don't let Hezekiah deceive you. He shall not be able to deliver you. Neither let Hezekiah make you trust until verse 17, I come and take you away. And the word you, all the way through that section, is in the masculine plural. This is a speech to many. It's a speech to the people. So we've got the speech to the king, and then we've got the speech to the people. And I think there's a key word in each of those speeches. If you just glance down verses 4 to 10 and run your eyes across it just swiftly and see if a word jumps off the page, because it should do, there's a key word. And that key word is trust, botak, to flee for refuge or to trust. It's found in verse 4 twice, verse 5, verse 6 twice, verse 7, verse 9, found 7 times. It's the key word, trust. And that's his speech to the king. Don't you continue to trust in your God. That's what Rabshakeh was going to attack as far as the king is concerned. But in the second speech, there's a different word. Now, can anyone spot that, reading from verses 13 to 20, just scanning through? Yes, you're absolutely right. It's the word deliver. Notzal, to snatch away or to rescue. It's in verse 14, 15, 18 twice, 19, 20 twice. Why? 7 times. So there's a key word in each of these speeches. And it relates to the key of what Rabshakeh is going to endeavour to deal with in the context of that speech. Now, isn't that interesting, that as soon as we have a break-up to the speech, suddenly Isaiah 36 becomes manageable, becomes intelligible. Now we see the direction in which this chapter is heading, and we can make sense of what Rabshakeh is now about to cover in his discourses. Now, for those that are continuing to write, I extend my heartfelt apologies, because I'm going to abruptly terminate that opportunity, because I'm going to come back now because of the compression of time to that first speech, because within each of these speeches, I think there's 2 sections as well. So if we come back now to this first speech to the king, I think there are 2 parts to the speech. And the first part is verses 4 to 7. And what Rabshakeh is endeavouring to do here is to create uncertainty through the shock of insider intelligence. He's going to actually really shock the king that he knows so much about the inner workings of Judah. It's a classic technique to break confidence. And then from verses 8 to 10, he's going to undermine confidence through the anxiety of psychological warfare. Oh, he was a master, this man. And we're going to see just how cunning and how devious he was as the story unfolds. So let's come to the speech, shall we then, reading from Isaiah 36 and verse 4, where the record says, And Rabshakeh said unto them, Say ye now to Hezekiah, Thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, What confidence is this wherein thou trustest? Now, in the Hebrew, that word confidence, bitakon, is a cognate form of the word trust, botak, at the end of the verse. So it's actually one of the 7 times that word is used. So in effect, what Rabshakeh really said was, what trust is this wherein thou trustest? Now that's the key word in Rabshakeh's speech to the king. But you see, what that tells us is that Rabshakeh obviously already knew that the outstanding characteristic of Hezekiah was his extraordinary trust in Yahweh his God. Now, Judah knew the faithful spirit of their king, but how could the spokesman from Assyria possibly know that was the situation as far as Hezekiah was concerned? And yet he did. Somehow Rabshakeh did. He knew that. He knew that trust was the vital quality of the king, and he was going to seek to undermine that. And he was going to focus on attacking that trust in any way he could to sow doubt in Hezekiah's mind. So this is what he says in verse 5. He said, I say, sayest thou, but they are but vain words. I, Hezekiah, have counsel and strength for war. And so Rabshakeh's assessment was that Hezekiah's claim of counsel to form plans and power to execute them were just empty words. They're just empty words, says Rabshakeh. But notice the very fact that Rabshakeh mentioned this, I think, was an indication that he was fully aware of Hezekiah's speech to the people that we've just come across in Chronicles. Because remember what it said, don't turn it up, but it said this. Hezekiah spoke to the people saying, "Be not afraid nor dismayed. There be more with us than with him." And the people rested themselves upon the words of Hezekiah. And Rabshakeh says, "You have vain words." He knew all about what was happening inside Jerusalem, did this man, including the king's inspiring speech to his people. Only the inhabitants of the city had heard that speech, and Rabshakeh knew all about it. Can you imagine how that must have shocked the deputies as Rabshakeh made these comments and displayed that inside knowledge and awareness of what was happening in the little kingdom of Judah? And so he says, verse 5, "On whom dost thou trust that thou rebellest against me?" And I think that Rabshakeh was saying, your words have nothing to substantiate them, O Hezekiah, unless there's something secret going on in the background. And I think I know what you're up to. He says, "I'm on to you," he says Rabshakeh. "I know exactly what you're up to." And this is what he says in the next verse. Verse 6, "Lo," he says, "I know, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt, wherein if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all that trust in him." Now that was a really telling blow, that comment from Rabshakeh, because you see there had been a delegation to Egypt, but we don't believe that it was at the instigation of King Hezekiah. In fact, if you just come back to Isaiah 30, the prophet had already warned the nation against going to Egypt, and I believe that Hezekiah absolutely believed in Isaiah's advice. I don't think this was Hezekiah's initiation, this delegation that went to Egypt. Isaiah 30 says, verse 1, "Woe to the rebellious children, saith Yahweh, that take counsel but not of me, and that cover with a covering but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, that walk to go down into Egypt and have not asked at my mouth, to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh and to trust in the shadow of Egypt." You shouldn't do that, he says. There's no help from that quarter. And again, chapter 31, verse 1. "Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help and stay on horses and trust in chariots because they're many and in horsemen because they're very strong, but they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek Yahweh." That was Isaiah's counsel, and I believe that Hezekiah supported it. He knew that Isaiah was absolutely giving the advice of God himself. But against that advice, a delegation had gone down, bearing gifts and seeking help of the Egyptians. So says Isaiah 30, verses 4 to 7. But I do not believe it was led by Hezekiah. I believe it was led by other members of his cabinet who took advantage of a moment when the king could not prevent them, as a later study will show. But the real issue of Isaiah 36 and verse 6, brothers and sisters, is this, that trip to Egypt was supposed to be top secret. But Rabshakeh knew all about it. You see, it was obvious that he had inside sources of information which must have been deeply unsettling to the king and to his deputies. What more did the Assyrians know? Well, as it turned out, quite a bit, because in verse 7 he says, "If thou say to me, we trust in Yahweh our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah hath taken away, and said to Judah and to Jerusalem, ye shall worship before this altar?" Now that's interesting, because Rabshakeh's information was correct, but his conclusions were wrong. Because we were told in Hezekiah's Reformation, in a passage earlier in Chronicles, these words, it says in 2 Chronicles 31 verse 1, "Now when all this was finished, all Israel went out to the cities of Judah and brake the images in pieces and cut down the groves and threw down the high places and the altars." Notice those expressions here in Isaiah. "Threw down the high places and altars out of Judah until they had utterly destroyed them all." So the whole nation had participated in that act. But the high places and the altars that they destroyed, verse 7, were not the high places to Yahweh. They were high places to pagan gods. And the nation had supported their king in that work of destruction. And all Israel, all Judah knew that the one altar where they should be offering their offerings to God was at the temple in Jerusalem, the only place where God commanded them to bring their offerings. So Hezekiah's thought, verse 7 here, that Yahweh had been angered by a king who'd taken away his own altars was false. But again, the fact remained that Rabshakeh knew all about Hezekiah's reformation and what he'd done in the kingdom of Judah. It must have been very disturbing that a man from foreign lands knew so much about the inner workings of Judah's kingdom. And now, having unsettled them in such a way, he moved to the next stage of his work of coercion by means of seeking to increase their anxiety through psychological warfare. So he says, verse 8, now therefore, he says, give pledges, I pray thee, to my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give thee 2,000 horses, if thou be able on thy part to set riders upon them. The Revised Margin says, now therefore, make a wager with my master. And so the boast of the verse was, he said, look, he said, I'll provide 2,000 horses. Do you really think that you can find 2,000 riders who would even know how to ride them? And of course, the fact was, Hezekiah probably couldn't. And Rabshakeh knew it. So his wager was really a sarcastic comment on just how pitifully small Judah's fighting resources were compared to the immensity of the Assyrian host, which you might remember in verse 2 has been described already as a great army. So how damaging this must have been to the morale of Hezekiah and his men. How disheartening to be reminded that the odds against them in this battle were absolutely overwhelming. You see, Rabshakeh was a master at undermining confidence by sowing seeds of doubt. And so he says, verse 9, how then wilt thou turn away the face of one captain of the least of my master's servants and put thy trust in Egypt? The New King James Version says, how then will you repel one captain of the least? Or another translation, slightly more, dynamic equivalent says, how could you defeat even our lowest ranking officer? So Rabshakeh was highly disparaging of their complete inability to seriously stand against the might of Assyria. But there was one more thing he had to say, and perhaps the most telling blow of all, because he says this in verse 10, and am I now come up without Yahweh against this land to destroy it? Yahweh said unto me, go up against this land and destroy it. Now, it was an unbelievable claim when you think about it, to suggest that Sennacherib had come against Judah at the express instruction of Yahweh himself, except it was true. Because Isaiah the prophet had already said these words, O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. I will send him against an hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge to take the spoil and to take the prey and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 and 6. So Sennacherib was coming to execute God's judgments. How could Hezekiah argue about that? How could he respond? And how did Rabshakeh know about Isaiah's prophecy? By the time his speech to the king was ended, it was very clear that the enemy without was being aided and abetted by the enemy within. There were spies in the camp of Judah, and the threat of that must have been very disturbing indeed. Rabshakeh's disclosure and his dialogue were absolutely shattering in their effect. Well, that leads to the interchange which now occurred between Rabshakeh and the three deputies of Hezekiah. So it's this middle section here, if we just come back. So now we've got the exchange, verses 11 and 12. And what Rabshakeh was going to endeavour to do in this exchange was to instigate fear through the terror of coarse reality. So what happens is that Eliakim and Shebna and Joah, verse 11, said unto him, speak, I pray thee, unto thy servants in the Syrian language, for we understand it, and speak not to us in the Jews' language that are in the ears of the people that are on the wall. Now, you might remember later on in this chapter, although we didn't read it, but verse 21, the king's instruction was, don't you say a word to Rabshakeh. Well, the 3 deputies made the mistake of doing so, because they recognized that this man was undermining the nation. It was absolutely damaging their faith. And so they were so concerned about the negative impact of his speech that they did the thing the king said not to. They spoke a word. And they pleaded with him to speak in a different tongue. And it was the worst thing they could have done, because Rabshakeh, skilled at seeing signs of anxiety and fear, immediately swung round so that he could make sure that all the onlookers on the wall could hear every word which followed. Bad mistake. And these were the words that he then addressed, verse 12, in response to the request of the deputies. Now, this is one of these verses, brothers and sisters, we need to read with care, because we need to understand through the vulgarity of the language what the meaning really was. And so he said, verse 12, Rabshakeh said, hath my master sent me to thy master and to thee to speak these words? No, he says, hath he not sent me to the men that sit on the wall, that they may eat their own dung and drink their own urine with you? And in effect, what he was really saying was, don't worry about not wanting to share the news with these other people on the wall. When the siege comes and we've got you all trapped inside, you'll all share together. And they might as well know now what they're going to be sharing with you, because it won't matter what language I say it in. You'll share in the horror of being so desperate for nourishment in the siege that you'll eat and drink that which comes of yourself in order to try and survive. So you might as well know now what you're all going to share, he says. His words were brutal and vulgar, but perfectly designed to terrify people into submission, don't you think? The horrors of a siege to come. And then came the speech to the people. And that's from verses 13 to 20. And just as there were 2 sections in the speech to the king, I think there are 2 parts of Rabshakeh's speech to the people. So this is how it looks. From verses 13 to 17, he sought to induce surrender through the cunning of benevolent blandishments. It'll all be all right, he says. I can offer you good things. Just come along with me, cooperate. All you need to do is cooperate. And then finally, from verses 18 to 20, he sought to destroy trust through the power of irrefutable evidence. You really think that your God can deliver you? I'll give you the utter proof that it's completely impossible for him to do so. So here it is, the speech now to the people themselves. Verse 13. He cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language. So he could speak fluent Hebrew, you see, and so he did, straight back to the men on the wall. And he was at pains to convince them to abandon their loyalty to Hezekiah, to break the moral hold that their king had upon them for good in trusting in Yahweh. It was a deliberate attempt to divide them from their king and to undermine their confidence in him. See, this verse 14, let not Hezekiah deceive you. Verse 15, neither let Hezekiah make you trust in Yahweh. Verse 16, hearken not to Hezekiah. Verse 18, beware lest Hezekiah entice you. See, Rabshakeh was endeavoring to divide the people from their king. And just as there was a key word in his early address to the king himself about the matter of trust, so now the key word, as we've noticed in the second speech, is the question of deliverance, because that was the issue at stake, you see, now that he's talking to the people. Was Yahweh their God powerful enough to deliver them from this crisis? And was Hezekiah their king right in asking them to commit to such implicit trust in their God? Well, Rabshakeh would come to that, but before he did, he tried an alternative approach, which was designed to induce their surrender by the promise of, well, peace and plenty if they were just prepared to cooperate. So he says, verse 16, he said, hearken not to Hezekiah. He said, thus saith the king of Assyria, make an agreement with me, he says, buy a present and come out to me. Now, that word agreement, you might notice, is not in the original. And the word present usually means a blessing. So the Septuagint says, if you would be blessed, come forth unto me. The Revised Version says, make your peace with me and come out to me. And it's that second phrase that I think tells us the story of what Rabshakeh was really asking. Come out to me, he says. But what does that really mean, come out to me? It means to go out and surrender. It means to walk outside, to give themselves up, and to concede defeat. And that little phrase, come out, is used that way in other Bible passages. 1 Samuel 11, verse 3. 2 Kings 24, verse 12. Jeremiah 21, verse 9. Come out meant to give up, to surrender absolutely. So what Rabshakeh was asking for was their total capitulation to Sennacherib in exchange for the guarantee that their lives would be safe, with the promise of some return to normality. And he made it sound so good. Verse 16, he says, eat ye every one of his vine and every one of his fig tree, and drink every one of the waters of his own cistern. But where do those words come from? Did you catch the echo? That's Micah chapter 4, verse 4, isn't it? They shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. Why? Rabshakeh made it sound almost biblical, what he was offering. But not only could he quote the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 10, but he knew about Micah chapter 4. He could quote Hebrew prophets back to Hebrew people, did this man. So verse 17 says, until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of corn and wine, a land of bread and vineyards. It all was presented as a wonderful alternative, the alluring prospect of peaceful resettlement in another land that was rich and fertile. No threat to war, no constraint to freedom. But behind his promises, there lurked a much more sinister objective, because the reality was that Rabshakeh was only promising really a temporary respite until the Assyrians returned to complete their control. And when they did, Judah would be taken away. They would be subject to enforced deportation to a foreign land. They would lose their national identity. They would be separated from the land of their fathers. So when he said, a land like your own land, he said, but even if that land did have corn and wine and oil and honey, the difference was that land would be given to them by Sennacherib. So he would be their sovereign lord, and they'd owe their continued allegiance to him. They wouldn't be any more living as Yahweh's people in Yahweh's land, serving Yahweh as their God. They would serve Sennacherib. The price of freedom was surrender, with all its consequences. But for those on that day, in that city on the wall, facing the threat of brutal, savage, merciless annihilation, and whose hearts were not stayed upon their God, even that prospect might have seemed attractive. And so, having carefully placed that possibility before them, Rabshakeh now came back to the question of whether deliverance through their king or by their God was even possible at all. And so he says this in verse 18, beware lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, Yahweh will deliver us. That word persuade, incidentally, is used elsewhere, meaning to entice or to incite. So I think what Rabshakeh was claiming is that what Hezekiah was doing and asking the nation to trust in God was to entice them in the sense of leading them astray. Don't let him mislead you, was what Rabshakeh was saying. And then he says why, verse 19, or at the end of verse 18. Hath any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arphad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? And have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Now, that was a telling blow, verse 19, more than you realize, brothers and sisters, because it's one thing to say, where are the gods of Hamath and Arphad, and where are the gods of Sepharvaim? None of those nations were delivered out of the hand of the Assyrians by their gods, but who was the god of Samaria? The god of Samaria was Yahweh, who already had been unable to deliver the northern kingdom, apparently, out of this hand of King Sennacherib. Now, the fact is that Yahweh had permitted Israel to be carried away into captivity, but Rabshakeh's inference was that even the god of Samaria had been powerless to resist the Assyrian might. Imagine what the people of the wall felt about that. So he says, verse 20, who are they among all the gods of these lands that have delivered their land out of my hand, that Yahweh should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? So if not one of these gods has been able to deliver their people, why would you believe that Yahweh can do what no one else can do? So here's the final thrust of Rabshakeh. But this really is where he made his fatal mistake. Because you see, he'd done his best to cast doubts on Hezekiah, but now at the very end of his message, he blasphemed the name and the character of Yahweh himself. And it was that thought that would finally spell the doom of Rabshakeh's mission. He was a skilled man, this one. His challenge had been a masterpiece of coercion and a masterclass in the power of hostile propaganda. But now his speech was ended, and he awaited the reply of the deputies. Verse 21 says, "But they held their peace and answered him not a word. For the king's commandment was, saying, answer him not." See, in most places where Rabshakeh had been sent, his verbal onslaughts had been enough, all by themselves, to break morale, to engender fear, and even to induce surrender. But this time, despite the fact that he was an expert in provoking a response, this time was very different. There was no reply at all. None of the three spokesmen standing before him on behalf of the king had anything to say. And here's the interesting thing, not a single person on that wall spoke a word. It shows you, don't you think, how powerful was the king's leadership of Judah at this moment when they all obeyed him to a man. Not a single person broke rank. And the reason was that Hezekiah uniquely had that ability to inspire them to trust in God like no other king had ever been able to do. And so the messengers of the king simply turned around and went back into the city without comment. Amazing. You know, brothers and sisters, there's a lesson here, is that in times of crisis, there can be great strength in learning to keep silence. Psalm 39, verses 1 and 2 says, "I'll keep my mouth with a bridle while the wicked is before me. I was dumb with silence." Proverbs 10, verse 19 says, "In the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise." Proverbs 17, verse 28 says, "Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise, and he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding." Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 and 7 says, "There is a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak." And you see, the thing about silence, brothers and sisters, is that sometimes in moments of real crisis, it could be best that silence is at least our first response. So Rabshakeh received no supply to energize his next attack, no feedback to help in deciding his next approach, no response to give any clue as to whether his speech had worked or not. He didn't know whether the people had been swayed towards capitulation or whether they'd remained resolute in their determination to stand against Sennacherib. So perhaps there was some wisdom in Hezekiah's silence. He wouldn't communicate with him, and his commandment not to answer him left Rabshakeh at the end at a complete disadvantage. He had to leave, baffled by the experience. But there was no doubt that the delegation of the king was shaken by the words they'd heard, because you see what verse 22 says, "Then came Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, that was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah the son of Asaph the recorder to Hezekiah, with their clothes rent, and told him the words of Rabshakeh. And neither they nor the king were under any illusion as to the crisis which they faced. The very survival of the nation was under threat. And humanly speaking, the possibility of escape from that threat seemed impossible." So this is what the king did. Isaiah 37, verse 1, "It came to pass when King Hezekiah heard it, that he rent his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of Yahweh." Now you'll know, brothers and sisters, that sackcloth means many things in Scripture, but just notice this in terms of what it is associated with. In Esther 4, verse 1, sackcloth and ashes are associated with bitter crying. In Isaiah 58, verse 5, sackcloth and ashes are associated with the afflicting of our soul. In Jeremiah 6, verse 26, sackcloth and ashes are associated with mourning and bitter lamentation. And in Daniel 9, verse 3, sackcloth and ashes are associated with prayers and supplications. And I think all of these things were involved in the spirit of what Hezekiah sought to do at this particular moment of time. Now stop and think about this for a moment. Hezekiah hadn't asked for this crisis. He hadn't done anything worthy of this invasion. It wasn't his fault. But do you notice, brothers and sisters, that in the context of what he does, he didn't assume any personal righteousness before his God. Instead, he humbled himself and did what he always did in times of trouble. He came before his God in prayer. And in that action, he took time to reflect upon the crisis that lay before him. He didn't assume any matter of right before his God. He put sackcloth on immediately. So here's the question. What do we do? And how do we react when facing a crisis that feels so overwhelming that it looks like there's no way out? And perhaps our first lesson from this matter of crises in life and how to face them, perhaps our first lesson is to be found in the king's response here, because I don't think it was just a matter of silence, you see. I think there was something more to what Hezekiah was doing here. And I think this is our first lesson, brothers and sisters, in terms of what to do when crisis comes upon us. And it's this. We need to take time for careful assessment. Doesn't matter what the crisis is. We need to take time to think it through. Just have a look at these passages. Proverbs 14, verse 29, he that's slow to anger is of great understanding, but he that's hasty of spirit exalteth folly. Or again in Proverbs 19, verse 2, the soul that be without knowledge, it's not good, and he that hasteth with his feet sinneth. Or Proverbs 29, verse 20, seest thou a man that is hasty in his words? There's more hope of a fool than of him. Or again in Ecclesiastes 5, verse 2, be not rash with thy mouth, let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God, let thy words be few. And all these passages and these words, brothers and sisters, all suggest an impetuosity of spirit that's too quick, too anxious, too rushed. In times of crisis, there's a need to take a pause before we do anything. Because the stress of a crisis can so easily lead to making hasty judgments or rash decisions. When our defenses are down and our emotions run high, it's easy to jump to conclusions before collecting all the facts or to react unwisely before assessing all the consequences. There's great wisdom in having a pause. Time to assess. Do you know that someone once said, I think it was incorrectly attributed to Einstein, but I don't think it was he, but someone once said these words, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes in seeking to solve it. And I think what that statement illustrates, you see, is it's possible for us to think in our haste that we've solved the problem, only to find that we've addressed the symptoms of the problem, that we haven't understood the problem at all. I think a lot of crises are like that. We need time to even know what the problem is. And there's another very good reason why we need to take our time. Because part of working through any issue properly requires us to bring the scriptures to bear upon that issue. What Bible principles, what Bible passages stand related to this problem, and how best might we deal with it? What are the changed circumstances which this crisis could lead me into? Or what is the altered condition which this crisis has already produced? And now what is the best scriptural counsel that might guide me in the steps I now need to take? Taking time for careful assessment, and especially in times of crisis, I think is a divine principle. It will help us to face the issues of life with better understanding. We need a thorough knowledge of what the problem really is, and a much more carefully nuanced basis on how best to respond in a matter and in a manner which most of all will seek to honour our God. If we can take counsel from Hezekiah in this matter, we'll be all the better for it, brothers and sisters. As one of our hymns said, the hosts of God encamp around the dwellings of the just. Deliverance he affords to all who on his succour trust. Fear him, ye saints, and you will then have nothing else to fear. Make you his service your delight. Your wants shall be his care.